Hello and welcome to my very first YouTube video. And in this video I will cover if statements. This video is aimed towards beginners or anyone interested in learning structured text. And the concepts I will cover in this video will apply to most, if not all, programming languages. Let's start by looking at an if statement in its most basic form, and then we'll gradually build from there. So what is actually happening here? First, we have the keyword if. This keyword tells the PLC you want to check something. This something is called a condition to whether or not to execute the code underneath it. After the condition, we have another keyword, then. Anything that comes after then will be the code you want to execute if the condition returns true. And this code can be anything and how many lines you prefer. You can even have another if statement nested inside. And the last part is the end if, which is also a keyword, and that's how we end our if statement. Now let's take a closer look at the condition. A condition can be either true or false. And with the condition you might want to check if a button was pressed, if a temperature is above a certain value, or a combination of checks using a logic gate like AND in this case. But remember, the entire condition itself always evaluates either true or false, meaning that both these conditions must return true since they are joined by an AND gate. Now let's go back to our first if statement and add some real code and variables. Here you can see that if our condition, which checks a variable named start button, is true, if this is met, we set another variable called pump to true. You might notice that I wrote the condition as if start button equals true. This actually isn't necessary. You can just write if start button since the condition by default checks for a true value. But what if we want the condition to check if start button is not pressed, meaning it's false? Then we can write it as if not start button, and not is another logical gate which basically reverses the value. Meaning the condition will be true if start button is not true. It sounds more confusing than it is, but I think you understand. Now let's say we want to turn off the pump when start button is no longer true. That's where the next part comes in, the else. Maybe you're thinking now, but couldn't we just write like this? As this gives us the same functionality but with a lot less code. But the powerful thing about if statements is that they let us do a lot more. For example, maybe we also want to update the text on the HMI to show the operator what's happening. We can add as much code as we want. The last part of the if statement is the else if. Well, actually it's not the last part, but the last part I cover in this video. We use else if when we want to check multiple conditions and act differently depending on which condition is true. An important thing to understand is that only one of these conditions will be executed, and it will always be the first one from the top that returns true. This can get tricky, especially if you have too many else ifs, so I'd actually recommend keeping their use to a minimum when possible. Maybe it's just me, but I rarely ever use else if. To show you what I mean, let's look at an example. Do you see anything wrong here? Actually, we'll never reach the else if because we're already checking start button in the first if, and that code will run as soon as the condition is met, meaning we will never reach the else if. To fix this, we need to switch things around like this. Now, as you can see, we'll first check if the start button is pressed and the temperature is above 20. If this is true, we execute this code. But if only the start button is pressed and the temperature is below 20 degrees, we move to the else if where we only check start button. In that case, only that block of code under the else if will be executed. So in case you want to check for two conditions and act on both, you can create two if statements like this. That's it for this video. I hope you learned something useful. The best way to learn is to experiment and play around, so please go and do that. If you'd like to see more videos in the future, I'd really appreciate it if you like and maybe even subscribed. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please write a comment. Thank you so much for watching.